Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. John, I don't want to be disrespectful to Paul, but it's like a soap opera of a life at the moment as he gets bounced around through these final few chapters of Acts to whoever will basically not treat him justly or fairly, or just as there seems to be a little bit of hope, it turns out that that person too's on the side of the people that are trying to kill him or not willing to stand up. And it's a bit of a roller coaster for us as readers that love Paul.
Indeed.
Yes, he's experiencing a lot.
Absolutely. It's sort of like at one point you read, can somebody not just sort this out? How hard can this be? And you sort of think, right, maybe they've got so much on their in tray that they just can't get to this guy. But it seems like a simple issue from where we're sitting. But of course, it shows the complexity and nuances of Rome's rule of Israel at that time, and the fact that there are minefields all over the place, and favors being curried, and personalities being entertained, and of course big agendas around all of that. So when you've got Felix's reign, which has been really known for its corruption and instability, I suppose Festus has to come in and try and engender as much favor as possible, thinking of his own career, let alone the context he's in. So it does feel like Paul is being bounced around, and different people are getting to hear what he has to say. Yeah,
I was trying to think of a way to phrase it, because there was a part of me initially was thinking about Paul's experience with powerful people, but I realized that, and this is a subtle critique that Luke draws our attention to, I think, that Rome is powerful, has power, and the people that Jesus encounters in his trial, that Paul's encountering here, they have power, but they're not strong people. And I think maybe I say it like, they have power, but they are not powerful. So you notice Pilate he's scared. He's scared of Rome. He's scared of the authorities of the Jewish mob that are coming for Jesus. And you see that in the gospel stories, don't you? He's thinking one thing, then they make a comment about Caesar, and that freaks him out. And the same seems to be happening here. That what Paul is lacking is a truly strong person around him to do what is right. Instead, you're just getting caught. And I wonder if Luke intends us to see a little bit of that critique, that these systems that are very powerful often don't have powerful people in them. You have a lot of yes people, and a lot of people hanging on, and a lot of people just trying to keep their own comforts and privileges. And then in the midst of it, we have this truly faithful Paul who is not backing down on his message. I've not done anything wrong here, so I'm not giving up on that.
I think what Paul needs here is a leader who is strong with integrity, strong with a sense of justice, strong with a sense of doing the right thing. And of course, the Hebrew Bible, of which Paul represents at that moment, is absolutely saturated with this idea of those who would stand with oversight or leadership of the people of God should be people of justice and righteousness and integrity. It's not the strength of their arm that is ultimately their strength according to the Torah, but the strength of their heart and the uprightness of their heart. And I love when it says of David that he led, I think it's Psalm 78, isn't it, off the top of my head? I think he led the people, he shepherded them, fed the people with a sense of integrity of heart, and he led them with the skill of his hands. There's this beautiful connection of both heart and hands in that lovely psalm. I think it's the very last verse of Psalm 78, if I'm quoting that correctly off the top of my head. But I do love that. I do love this idea that for a biblical leader, it is not simply their physical strength or their organizational strength or their military strength, but the most important thing before God is strength of integrity, strength of heart, strength of honor, strength of truth, righteousness, justice, mercy. These are the things that the prophets ask of their kings, that they would walk humbly before their God, doing justice and mercy. And I think we are absolutely seeing a critique on that. I think we're seeing leaders that seem to be lacking, Pilate included, because you've mentioned him, lacking just a sense of personal integrity. Just do the right thing, because the right thing is a good thing to do. But of course, me and you sitting here in the comfort of our studies, they're under the pressure of a million things that don't always want the right thing to be done.
Yes. Well, exactly. They're in a system that in and of itself is not asking those questions. And you don't need to just read Scripture. The critiques of the Roman Empire in that period are done outside of Scripture as well, as to how it was a very good empire for a very select group of people, and a very bad empire for most everybody else. So we left Paul appealing to Caesar from that empire, and the text then tells us that Paul makes this appeal. I assume some classic process now he needs to sort of kick in. But while that process is beginning, King Agrippa and Bernice arrive at Caesarea to pay respects to Festus, who has, who we shouldn't forget, has only just, he was 3 days in the province, and then 8 or 10 days later he goes to, so this guy's been a couple of days, a fortnight in his job, and now King Agrippa and Bernice have arrived, and Paul's case gets brought up between Festus and the king. And we'll jump a few verses in our reading here, because we essentially hear another repeating of the account from Festus's position as to what's going on with Paul and the plot against him, which results in Agrippa saying that he would actually like to hear from Paul himself. So what happens then is this court is created, this audience room, prominent people are brought together, and Paul is brought before Agrippa for an audience, essentially. But I don't know that it's an audience to get Paul out of anything, because Paul's appealed to Caesar, so it's out of everybody's hands now. But Paul gets a chance now to talk to King Agrippa about the story, and we're going to pick the story up from there. But does that work as a summary, John? Is that kind of?
I think it does. I love the little verse 23 of 25. Bernice and Agrippa came in with great pomp, entered the audience room, and the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. And I couldn't help read that and not hear the echo of the words the Lord Jesus spoke to Saul all those years ago in chapter 9, that he would be a chosen instrument to proclaim his name to the Gentiles and their kings and the people of Israel. And, again, I think in our last podcast, we talked about repeat and rhythm. I think you're hearing that again. Yes. Just that little, we've heard something like that before. And so I love that. So we've got this room filled with very, very important people. And I'm going to read the first bit of chapter 26, where we jump in again. So it says this: Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." I do love that. It does make me laugh every time. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jewish people all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they're willing, that I conform to the strictest sect of our religion living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. King Agrippa, it is because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises from the dead? I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the Lord's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven brighter than the sun blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic or Hebrew, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place amongst those who are sanctified by faith in me.
Such a great piece of text, John. And,
stunning.
There's a couple of things that strike me initially. One is, this is us hearing from Jesus once again in the book of Acts, which is lovely to just pause and be aware of how formative that moment for Paul really, really deeply was. He never forgot. And I don't say that, at some level you might say, well, how on earth could you forget a moment like that? But it's amazing how often we do forget the good things that God has done and said to us. But I'm struck by the tension of the story at some level, that this is Paul's last big speech in the book of Acts. It's the real big defense, isn't it? That he goes into the drama of it. He motions with his hand. He begins like Paul, and you feel this sense of the summary of everything's getting drawn up here. But then I also found myself pondering how what he actually offers as his defense is not actually a defense.
True.
But is a story of an experience of God.
So good. So good. Yeah, absolutely. It really is. He's actually not defending himself from the charges, because in our last podcast, we reflected on the fact that Paul said, I have not sinned against Torah, temple, or Caesar. So there's an explicit sense of defense against Festus that he's presented. But here, before Agrippa, maybe because Agrippa is aware of who Paul is, and certainly aware of the way and aware of Jewish custom, that Paul is making a different sort of defense. I mean, it's interesting, our listeners may catch this, but of the three defenses, we've had one in chapter 22, one in chapter 24, and now this one. This is the most explicit in terms of what we might call the good news of Jesus type stuff. So I think in the other two, you get a summary of the story. I think we're even getting words from Jesus that are more explicit than we've heard before.
Yes.
And also we're getting a sense of Paul, my goodness, opening up detail about his own persecution of the people of the way. I mean, it's quite powerful. I found myself very moved by Paul's words when he talks about, voting for people's execution trying to get people to blaspheme, even in the name of the Lord. And his language, David, I was so obsessed with persecuting the church. Because in our last podcast last time, we talked about those trying to kill Paul and the fact that they had become obsessed, myopic, completely focused to the point that it had held them for over 2 years. Yeah. Paul's saying, I had that same obsession. So the obsession that those who've tried to kill me had, actually I had for other members of the way. And it's it feels like a different level of defense. As you spotted, it's not really a defense. It's more a detailed story, really. but it feels more detailed. It feels more intimate. It feels more personal. It feels more powerful to me. And I know those are all subjective observations. Yes. But this, it's like he's speaking directly to Agrippa, and something very, very intimate and personal is being communicated to Agrippa that hasn't quite been communicated in the previous two defense moments. And I certainly feel that. It's more, can I say this? I know we'll get to the appeal, but it feels more like an appeal to a man than a defense of a man. Is that fair? It's like he's appealing to the room. He's speaking to the room rather than defending himself. That's what it feels like to me.
I've been pondering. Jennings uses this tension of this passage, which I like, where he says that Christianity is about an experience and God, both the movement of God on us and the movement of God through us. And then he says we should never pit experience against revelation, the soul against the spirit. Yeah. And he identifies that what Paul does here, if you spot it, is that he begins by telling his story, but then there's a moment where it becomes a revelation. Right? And I think it's a profound insight, even of how we as Christians do testimony. If a testimony is just simply, here's my story, then that's just your story. What Paul does here is it begins sounding like it's just going to be his story, but it peaks that we are now hearing from Jesus, right? Like we are, and to your point, your very astute observation. We actually, even we, the reader, are now hearing things from Jesus we've not heard before. Right? Like we are having a revelation to ourselves that is going on, and I think there's something really powerful in looking at that and thinking about that in our own context, or even in the context of this text, that we're dealing with revelation now. And this is where God starts to play. This is where God fits into things. And so what's interesting is you've picked up on this language of obsession, right? Now it's where we get the word maniac from. Actually, the Greek word manio that's used there is about maniacs. But look at this: you've got Paul the maniac living his own story, forcing people to blaspheme, hunting them down across cities, and then you get the revelation of God. Right? And that's why I love Jennings' line, the movement of God on us. So he encounters this Jesus, and then through us, right? And that's, I mean, there's a stunning blueprint of Christian testimony now happening for us here that I don't think we should miss.
So good. I have little to add. That is just stunning, and I think it's a beautiful, beautiful observation. And if I could add just anything to that, it would be, I love also the contrast that Paul is not hiding his own brokenness in the story.
No.
He's not hiding his own obsessional madness in this story. Of course, he wouldn't have thought of it as madness back then. He would have seen it as zeal for the Lord. He was zealous for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But this obsessional zeal drove this man to do unspeakable things that up to this point he's hinted at, and the story of Acts is hinted at, but we haven't really got the detail. And he starts giving us some serious detail here. And I can't help but feel it later on in his own writings when he describes himself as the chief of sinners. Is all of this in the mix? Is this sense of, my goodness, in the name of God, in the name of the Lord of our fathers, I did unspeakable things. I gave my consent to the execution of a friend, Stephen. All those episodes ago when we dealt with that, and he's making it clear, and he wasn't the only one that I did this to. And then this beautiful, beautiful change that happens when he encounters the Lord. The whole tone of this change is it's that, and I don't know if you noticed this, David. It's not even like the Lord addresses Paul's sin or addresses the wickedness that Paul has been engaged in. He simply recommissions Saul in this moment, sends him, and you get this incredible. You have it in this passage, like you don't even have the sense of it in the original story in chapter 9. I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Now then, get up and stand on your feet. I've appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and a witness. And it's this almost this sense of, you've been commissioned by the chief priests and the elders. You've been commissioned to destroy the way. Now I've come to commission you to live for me. And you get this magnificent commissioning language, having been commissioned, and then that original commissioning brought terrible acts of suffering. And you could even use the word depravity in the context of his religious zeal. Now he's been recommissioned in Jesus, but what to do to open the eyes of those whose eyes are closed, turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified. What incredible transformation in this. And of course, the person who transforms both ends of the commissioning by the chief priests, the commissioning by Jesus, is Jesus himself. He's the one who so that this zealous Paul, this zealous Saul, is still this zealous person. He's just now been repurposed, recommissioned by this revelatory experience with Jesus Christ. And I love that, David. I love your summary. I thought was magnificent. And again, this sense of recommissioning that is taking place of Saul, now Paul, by this revelatory encounter with Jesus Christ. It's transformed him.
In that particular area as well, I was fascinated, John. This feels like a very two-texty moment that I'm going to go everywhere with, perhaps. Verse 17, I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles, right? It's not a terrible translation, and I don't ever, my goodness, I'm not a Bible translator. It's a tough job. And I actually recently have come to know some people that were involved in some of the well-known Bible translation projects, and when you listen to the complexity of choosing, they were prayerful people who carefully did what they did. And so the rescue is a good and fine word, but it carries, just to kind of broaden the semantics of that for all of us, it carries the image of being plucked out, right? Yeah. So there's this sort of notion of Jesus. You remember that kids game Operation, where you had to kind of carefully reach into the human body and take out the bones sort of thing? Yeah. Like, Jesus is being very precision here. He has picked out you from your own people and from the Gentiles. Of all the people that Jesus could have chosen, he comes in and he picks them. Ex airo is the to lift up and to lift out is the Greek word that's used here. So I actually just really like that image, right? I like that image of, for some reason, rescuing. I have, these people almost invading with the rescuing forces, and that's a rescue. This is way more precision, that Jesus just picks him out. But because I was kind of curious about that, I was like, oh, this is an interesting word, ex airo, to be lifted up and lifted out. I went looking, and of course, this is in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. You'll never guess what you find. In Jeremiah 1 verse 8, you have, don't be afraid of them, for I am with you. I will lift you out, declares the Lord. And in Jeremiah 1:19, they'll fight against you, but will not overcome you, for I am with you, and I will lift you out, declares the Lord. And then I couldn't help but think, we know from Galatians that Paul thinks of himself in a Jeremiah vein, because he talks about being set apart from, from the womb. So I thought I have to share that with you, John, just to see, where do you go with something like that? But I think it's really a beautiful connection of Paul. This is maybe what I'm trying to say. When Paul in Galatians uses Jeremiah language of himself, we could think, it's a little arrogant, Paul, using Jeremiah language of yourself. But here, when we now hear Paul's testimony, you go, oh, wait a minute, maybe Paul uses the Jeremiah language because it's Jesus that first used Jeremiah language upon him.
Yeah, beautiful. That's I've never seen that. And that is a brilliant observation. That is just truly stunning. I would encourage listeners just to pause now, rewind the podcast and listen to that again. That is just outstanding observation. I'd always seen the sort of link to Jeremiah in terms of the Galatians language. I'd never seen it in Acts chapter 26 in those words of Jesus. That is just truly, it's brilliant. I love that. I will go and reflect on that and hunt that down. And of course, if you think about Paul and Jeremiah, there is a similarity in the sense that when Paul writes in Romans, he desperately wants his own people to receive Messiah, and he seems to lament that the ones he really wants to get Messiah aren't getting him in the way even that the Gentiles are getting him. And you do feel that tornness in Paul. I wish myself accursed that my people would be saved, sort of language in Romans. My prayer to God, is that Israel will be saved above all else. And you get that Jeremiah-esque feel in that Paul wasn't as well received by his own people as he maybe wanted to be, and yet found great reception among the Gentiles. So I love that. That is, but I'd never seen it from that. I'd never seen it from that passage. Seen it in Romans, seen it in Galatians, not seen it there. That was worth me turning up for the podcast. Come on. I love that. Yeah. I love that.
I just was blessed by it from the point of view that this, like you say, it's a theme we see in Paul quite regularly. I just love the notion that Paul didn't get it from his study; he got it from what the Lord said to him.
That's brilliant.
I mean, that's good, isn't it?
That's the gold bit. I've never. Yeah, you totally think. Yeah, did Paul make his own connection with Jeremiah? Because sometimes we could all have a sense of inflated ego about ourselves, but if Paul's relating his connection to Jeremiah back to the words of Jesus on the Damascus Road, that is gold-plated theology. That's just, you go, boom. Come on, people. Wherever you are, round of applause for that moment. That's just fantastic. That is fantastic. And maybe that sense, I mean, this was the beautiful verse that stood out for me, David. Verse 19. It caught me again as I was reading it. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. I just love this language. And of course, again, when you track Paul through his letters, you're hearing it over and over again. Summoned, called, servant, sent. Paul really does constantly repeat this sense of being grabbed, consumed. What does he say in Philippians? I have taken hold of that for which he took hold of me. I am apprehending that for which I've been apprehended. It's that sort of there's a sense that Paul is not just doing this because, life's changed. Paul is doing this because he has been apprehended. He's been taken hold of. And again, that's in the language of Jesus, where he says, get up, stand on your feet. I've appeared to appoint you servant and witness. I love that. And those ideas of servant and witness bleed all the way through Paul's language. He feels that sense of appointed. He feels the sense that he is now the servant of that one who appointed him, and he's a witness of this. And this sense of compulsion of the heavenly vision consumes him. He, in the same way that he says to Festus, I was obsessed in order to destroy the church. You get the sense of same obsessional language without the use of that language. I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven.
I was pondering that language shift as well, because you even see a little bit of it in verse 7 and 8. So pre-revelation of Jesus, Paul is maniacal.
Yes.
But if you notice his language, it is because of my hope in what God has promised our ancestors that I'm on trial today, right? This is the promise 12 tribes are hoping to see, but it's because of this hope I'm being accused. So it's amazing how, to put it to your point, that what is maniacal is not the energy, but the focus. And so Paul is maniacal because he's trying to force them to blaspheme. But that same energy now becomes hope. The revelation of Jesus turns the maniacal to the hopeful. And I think it's a really gorgeous theme that you're picking up on, that now from the insanity of trying to force people to blaspheme, I now am not disobedient because I have this hope. And I mean, this, verse 8 also has to be said. It's another one of my favorite Pauline lines. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Which, I mean, a beautiful line to ponder as we come into Easter season. But but this is what hope actually looks like. Why should you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Like, I've had a revelation of this Jesus. I know that this Jesus is raised from the dead. And of course, also, Paul's speaking to the fact that, and the people that are accusing me know that God raises the dead. This is not new news for the people of God. And so I really love that theme, though, just to not lose that. I love that theme that you're picking up on, of going from obsessed to obedient, from maniacal to hopeful, to, from lost to revealed to. It's a really beautiful theme.
Well, it is. And I think then it shows that though Paul looks as zealous before his encounter with Jesus, it looks like the same energy. It looks like the same drive. The heart at the center of that drive that is that he's being, to quote him from another one of his letters, constrained, compelled by the love of Christ. Whereas his obsession was out of, yes, absolutely, a love for the law and a love for God. But could we also say a hatred for his opponents?
Yes.
I mean, I might be too strong, but that obsessional language, out of mind language,
yes,
maniacal, is that sense of, okay, this is something else is going on here. But yet, when he meets Jesus, he's now constrained or compelled by love, which then takes all that same energy, but allows that energy to activate in a completely different mentality, in a completely different way. And I love that sense of then, I don't want to be, I cannot be, I will not be disobedient to that call, because it's not just the call of Torah, it is the call of the one who wrote the Torah. It's the call of Jesus himself, the Torah, the Word in flesh.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now, so until next time, from John and I, goodbye.